Our first reading is from Luke chapter 6, verses 17 and 20 to 26. Jesus came down and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. He looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you, on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice on that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven. For that is how their ancestors treated the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets." Here ends the first reading.
So last Sunday we read from Luke chapter 15 as we continue to follow Jesus on his way towards Jerusalem. I mentioned that's often known as the lost and found department of the Bible. It's those stories of the lost sheep and the lost coin and then the lost sons, the story we know better as the story of the prodigal son. And in those parables I mentioned last week that I think they invite us to consider the question of who counts, who's important and who matters in our own lives, in the lives of our church and of our community and of our world, recognizing that we often overlook or do not count many people around us. Well, as we move on to chapter 16, we see the focus shift towards wealth and possessions, both about who has them and who doesn't have them. At the beginning of chapter 16, Jesus begins with a parable that starts with this phrase, "There was a rich man." And you'll hear that repeated as I read from our parable in a few moments. At the end of that parable, in verse 13, Jesus said, "No one can serve two masters, wealth and money, or God and money, or God or wealth." We can't serve those two different masters, Jesus says. And then the next verse, he's speaking to the Pharisees, and he accuses them of being lovers of money, focused on wealth and possessions. Now, it's a reminder that we do have this responsibility, those of us who have wealth and income, that there's a danger on how we use them and how they can take up so much energy in our lives. And these responsibilities and warnings are woven throughout Luke's gospel from beginning to end. We just heard a little bit from Steve as he shared from what is known as the Sermon on the Plain, about the blessings to the poor and the woe to those who are rich. Likewise, in Luke chapter 12, Jesus says, "From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required." Excuse me. "And from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded." So there is responsibility that we have when we have our wealth and resources. Our second reading this morning comes from Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. You'll find it, if you want to read along, follow along on your insert. You'll note here that I'm using the Cotton Patch version of the gospel. This was done by a man named Clarence Jordan back in the 1940s and 50s. He had his PhD in New Testament and taught Greek. He also founded what was called the Koinonia Farm, an interracial community in Georgia in the 1940s. Well, let's listen again for God's word as we read this parable. "Once there was a rich man. He put on his tux and his fancy shirt, and he staged a big shindig every day. A poor man by the name of Lazarus was laid at his gate. He was covered with sores and so hungry that he was willing to fill up on the rich man's table scraps. On top of all of this, the dogs came and licked his sores. It so happened that the poor fellow died, and the angels carried him off and seated him at the table with Abraham. The rich man died too and was buried. In the hereafter, the rich man, in great agony, looked up, and he saw from afar Abraham and Lazarus sitting beside him at the table. And so he shouted to him, "Mr. Abraham, please take pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in some water and to rub it over my tongue, because I am scorched by this heat." Abraham replied, "Boy, you remember that while you were alive, you got the good things, the good jobs, schools, streets, houses, etc. While at the same time, Lazarus only got the leftovers. But now here, he's got it made, and you're scorching. And on top of all of this, someone has dug a yawning chasm between us and you. So people trying to get through from here to you can't make it. Neither can they get through from there to us." The rich man said, "Well then, Mr. Abraham, will you please send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him thoroughly warn them, so they won't come to this hellish condition." Abraham answered, "They've got the Bible and the preachers. Let them listen to them." And the rich man said, "No, they won't do that, Mr. Abraham. But if someone will go to them from the dead, I know that they will change their ways." Abraham replied, "Well, if they won't listen to the Bible and the preachers, they won't be persuaded if someone gets up from the dead." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. "47 years ago on this weekend, on March 31st, 1968 to be exact, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached the last sermon of his life. The setting for that sermon was the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. He'd been invited to preach there by the dean of the cathedral. And when he came, he happened to be in Washington at that time. He was about to kick off what was called the Poor People's Campaign, which was a grassroots and multiracial call for equality and peace. But he was also on his way to the city of Memphis. And as you probably remember, he was assassinated there 4 days later. What we often forget, though, is why he was in Memphis. He was there for a support for the sanitation workers of Memphis who were on strike. Because you see, back on February 1st of 1968, 2 of the Memphis sanitation workers had been killed. A man named Eckel Cole and the other man named Robert Walker. They were crushed to death in a malfunctioning garbage truck. Both men had taken shelter inside the back of the garbage truck of one of the old models because it was raining, and they weren't allowed into buildings for shelter during the rain. And in fact, on rainy days, the black workers could be sent home with only an hour or 2 of pay. But at the same time, their white supervisors were allowed to stay out of the rain for the whole day and get a full day's pay. In the ensuing marches, protesting their conditions, and you can look this up and you see the pictures of the men wearing a sign that says, "I am a man." In many ways, it's an echo of last week's parable, the question of who counts, who matters, and who is important. And the workers were claiming that, saying, "I am a man, a person." And King was there to support. So in his last sermon, though, a few days earlier, he actually references the parable that we've heard this morning already. Now, I came across the transcript of it, and I was going to read it, but I actually found a recording of that sermon. And so I thought it might be good for us to listen to a portion of it. It's only about 2 minutes. And as you hear this, you'll notice that when Dr. King talks about the sermon, he uses the name Dives, and that is the rich man. There's a tradition that that was his name. It comes from the Latin word for rich. Although Luke doesn't actually mention it, we often hear the parable being called the parable of Dives and of Lazarus. So I want to invite us to listen to this. It's about 2 minutes or so as he speaks to this particular sermon, this particular parable. Let me play it for us. Hopefully this all works.
Jesus told a parable one day, and he reminded us that a man went to hell because he didn't see the poor. His name was Dives. He was a rich man. And there was a man by the name of Lazarus, who was a poor man, but not only was he poor, he was sick. Sores were all over his body. He was so weak that he could hardly move. But he managed to get to the gate of Dives every day, wanting just to have the crumbs that would fall from his table. Dives did nothing about it. And the parable ends saying, Dives went to hell, and there was a thick gulf now between Lazarus and Dives. Dives didn't go to hell because he was rich. Dives didn't realize that his wealth was his opportunity. It was his opportunity to bridge the gulf that separated him from his brother Lazarus. Dives went to hell because he passed by Lazarus every day and he never really saw him. He went to hell because he allowed his brother to become invisible. Dives went to hell because he maximized the minimum and minimized the maximum. Indeed, Dives went to hell because he sought to be a conscientious objector in the war against poverty. And this can happen to America, the richest nation in the world. There's nothing wrong with that. This is America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. And the question is whether America will do it.
So the sermon is about 45 minutes long. I won't play the whole thing for us, but that's a portion of that parable as interpreted by Dr. King. Now, we noted that he was talking about the issues 47 years ago, and in many ways, while things have changed, it's not clear that they've necessarily improved. I read a news article recently that was dated the end of 2024, and it said that the collective net worth of America's top 12 billionaires now surpasses over $2 trillion. But their combined wealth increased by more than $1.3 trillion, by almost 200%, between March 2020 and December 2024, in the last 4 years. They also noted some other statistics saying that the top 10% of the households in America by wealth hold an average of $7.2 million. But as a group, they have 67.3% of the total household wealth in the country. 10% have almost 68% of the wealth. Whereas the bottom 50% of households by wealth had an average of $52,000. And as a group, they held 2.4% of the total household wealth in our nation. The article had an interesting title. It said, if the income gap, that's the money we earn each year, is a chasm, then the wealth gap, they said, is the Grand Canyon. That's how big it is. Now, income and wealth inequality, as we heard, is not a new or modern issue, as Jesus is addressing it in this parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Other more traditional translations of this describe the rich man, you may have heard this, as wearing purple robes and fine linen, which were the most expensive clothing you could possibly find. He was extraordinarily rich, feasting every single day, we are told, perhaps like one of those 12 billionaires cited in the article. Meanwhile, Lazarus was the poorest of the poor. You read in some commentaries that he is called a beggar, but that's not true. He was not even strong enough to beg. There were people who made a livelihood beggars, sitting out with their coats, receiving money. Lazarus was not able even to do that. He was starving. He was covered with sores, we're told. And there he was languishing at the rich man's gate. And although Lazarus was perfectly visible to the eye, in fact, you can tell that he looks in and even longs for a single crumb from the table of the man's banquet feast, the rich man does not acknowledge him. He does not try to alleviate his suffering. In fact, the story tells us that the neighborhood dogs showed the poor man more compassion than his wealthy human counterpart. They at least came and licked his sores, the parable tells us. But then it goes on and says, eventually both of them die. Lazarus, is quoted, is carried away by the angels to what is often quoted as the bosom of Abraham, to his side, to the most honored and beloved place next to Father Abraham. While the rich man, while he is buried, ends up in what is called Hades, or in hell, this place of torment for the dead. He is parched and desperate there in that place. And we have here, of course, a perfect reversal of the earthly circumstances of the two. And there the rich man looks up and he sees Abraham and Lazarus far away enjoying every comfort that he enjoyed in life. And so, of course, he begins to ask for his own good. He says, Mr. Abraham, Father Abraham, he says, send Lazarus to come and dip his finger in the water to cool my tongue, thinking that he now still has some kind of control over this Lazarus, who in life he never acknowledged. And he says, well, if not that, at least send Lazarus to warn my brothers who are still alive. But Abraham denies both of these requests because he said there is a chasm separating Lazarus and the rich man that no one can cross over. Now, we're not told exactly what that chasm is in the story, but I like the way one commentator put it. She said, the chasm between them was created by human selfishness and greed, and now it is fixed by God's justice that they cannot cross over. And so why does Jesus bring up this issue? Why does he talk about wealth and inequality and how we use our material resources? Well, I think Jesus is noting a very difficult hazard for us to be aware of as we are making our way on this journey of faith. I think he's saying that our pursuit of material goods and comforts, and in doing so, pursuing those, there is the danger of blindness, of apathy and indifference, the inability to see the human need of another, of suffering, to see another person's dignity. We can lose all of that perspective, Jesus says, in our pursuit for wealth and comfort. I think to really understand this parable, it's helpful to place it in the wider context of Luke's gospel and Jesus' ministry, especially now as he makes his way towards the holy city. Because I think Jesus is trying desperately to get us to see, to at least to somehow imagine the things that Steve just mentioned a few moments ago. That God blesses those who are poor and hungry, and that those who are well off and wealthy must be warned that they are walking the wrong path. There is a kingdom, Jesus says, where the hungry and the weeping and the poor are blessed. And that is the one he has come to proclaim. And so Jesus tells us again and again that this reign of God, this coming kingdom that he is embodying, is one of compassion and empathy. It's one where we care for one another and not only for ourselves. He says, in essence, there's two choices, there's two paths that we can take. We can serve the kingdoms of this world that often lead us to wealth and material good, or we can serve God's reign of love and compassion. But those two, Jesus says, cannot go together. You cannot serve both masters. There's an old story told about heaven and hell. It said that a saint is sent by God to visit both of these places. And as she approaches hell, she can hear the sound of wailing and crying. And so she's surprised when she enters and finds that there's a beautiful gate there and a garden filled with the most beautiful and luscious food and fruit. And in that garden there is a banquet table that is laden with all kinds of delicious foods. The people there in hell are clean and well dressed. There's no sign of any fiery furnace or torment. But the people are strangely shaped, the saint notices. Each of them have long arms but no joint at the elbow. And so they could pick up the food, but they could not feed themselves. And so they cried in anguish because they could not partake in the banquet in front of them. But suddenly the saint is transported to heaven. And there she's alarmed to see the very same scene she had just saw in hell. A beautiful garden, a banquet table laden with food, and people with long arms that they could not bend. But there is only the sound of songs and laughter in this place, not of anguish or despair, because they were reaching out and feeding one another across the table there in heaven. And so the story goes, the difference between heaven and hell is how we treat one another, how we deal with our fellow human beings. I discovered an interesting fact in reading about this parable this week, and that is that Lazarus is the only character in any of Jesus' parables who actually has a name. No one else is named. Now, we heard in Dr. King's sermon they talk about Dives, but that's not actually in the Scriptures. That's from tradition. Lazarus is the only one. And I think people consider that an important fact because Lazarus is the poorest of the poor. So I think Jesus is reminding us here that the poor are real people. They have names and identities and histories. They are not just statistics or people to ignore. They are human beings. And we cannot describe them or brush them off, but they are people with names, as Jesus tells us today. And in our parable, it's likely that most certainly the rich man knew Lazarus' name because he mentions it later when he is down there in Hades. At the very least, he had to step over him at the gate every day as he went in and out of his house. But he does nothing. Lazarus is not a stranger to the rich man. And in some ways, that makes his ignorance and his indifference even worse in the parable. Because the problem is he doesn't take any action from what he sees. He remains aloof and apart from his neighbor who he knows by name. The author Elie Wiesel once wrote this. He said, "The opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. The opposite of beauty is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of sacred is not profane, it is indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, but indifference." Now, as far as we know, the rich man never actively acted unkindly or cruelly towards Lazarus, but he was indifferent to his plight, ignorant to his pain and to his suffering. He notices him, he knows him by name, but he takes no action. So why then in this story, do you think, when he knows what to do, does he not take action? Why did the man not at least throw a crumb out of all of his riches? After all, he knows Moses and the prophets, he tells us. He knows what we are supposed to do. Well, one commentator surmised this. She said, to see Lazarus, to really see him, the rich man would have had to recognize his own complicity in the poor man's sufferings. He would have had to admit that his own inability to say that I have enough and I can share was responsible for the suffering and poverty of Lazarus. But he was not able or willing to do that. So, friends, where do we find ourselves in this parable? One of the powers of these stories is they invite us in and to play our part in the story. I think for most of us, we're probably not the rich man, although we're probably well enough off. We're not sumptuously banqueting every day. We don't have unlimited resources. But also, we are not Lazarus. We are not the poorest of the poor. If we need to eat, we have access to food. If we need health care, we can find a doctor. So maybe perhaps we are one of the 5 brothers of the rich man. One preacher put it this way. He said, perhaps we are the rich man's brothers and sisters. And like them, we not only have Moses and the prophets, but we also have Jesus, who has indeed risen from the dead. And like those brothers, we've been given all of the warning we need. All that remains to be seen is what we are going to do about it. And so the parable leaves us with a choice, I think. Will we continue to live in the world that we have made, a world that blesses the powerful and the wealthy and ignores the suffering and the poor? Or will we take that step into God's world, the kingdom of God, as Jesus calls it, a place where he says the first are last and the last are first, and where those chasms that are created are forever removed and bridged? I want to close with a quote from Dr. King. I'm just going to read this one for us. It's from an earlier sermon that he gave. He writes this. He said, I submit that this is the challenge facing the church, to be as concerned as our Christ about the least of these, about our brothers and sisters. And we must do it in the final analysis because we all live together, rich and poor, lettered and unlettered, tutored and untutored. We are tied together, he said, by a single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And so he says, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be who you ought to be unless I am who I ought to be. This is the way God made the world, King said. And we must live together as brothers and sisters, or we will all perish as fools. Friends, to God be all praise and honor and glory this day. Amen.